Good day. Today is Friday, 14th March 2025, and in my program yesterday, I speculated that though the Russians would almost certainly reject the proposal for a temporary ceasefire that was made in Jeddah, they would qualify their proposal in a way that would suggest to the Americans that they're not simply slamming the door. And the reason that is so is because the Russians do want to maintain a dialogue with the United States, with Donald Trump, and that their ultimate reason for doing so is not because they want to rejoin the West or integrate themselves into the West, as some people are speculating, not because they want to return to how it was before the 2014 crisis or anything like that, but because they are concerned about the security of their western borders, and that they understand that if that security is to be achieved without a permanent military build-up, some kind of understanding with the United States is the only way to do it, and that the time to do it is probably now, whilst Donald Trump is President of the United States, because there's never any certainty that any future president could be so accommodating. Well, I'm going to say that events over the course of the day followed fairly in line with my expectations. The Russians did, in effect, reject the ceasefire proposal made in Jeddah, but they did so very carefully in a way that absolutely did not upset, or was not calculated to upset or humiliate Donald Trump, and which, in effect, opens the way for further discussions. And those discussions continue to be underway. And there was an important meeting between Putin, apparently, and Steve Witkoff, Trump's envoy. And there's some speculation today, which I think is perhaps wrong, that Trump and Putin have already spoken. Though, as I said, I myself think that this is a misunderstanding of what has taken place. Now, let me continue, in effect, from where I left off yesterday. Yesterday, I left off at the statements made by Ushakov, Putin's key foreign policy aide. And by the way, it turns out that telephone calls and conversations which take place between the Russians and the Americans are not being conducted by Mike Waltz and Sergei Shoigu. Sergei Shoigu is Putin's national security advisor and therefore the direct equivalent of Mike Waltz. They are being conducted between Mike Waltz and Ushakov. Now, there is a reason for this, which is that, of course, Shoigu was previously the Russian defense minister, and he is sanctioned. So the Americans might find it a bit awkward to conduct a direct dialogue with him, but they would not have those problems, those concerns with Ushakov, who is a civilian and who, to the best of my knowledge, has not been sanctioned, at least not sanctioned in the way that Shoigu has been, and not been accused in the American media of some of the things that Shoigu has been accused of. There is also, by the way, another reason why the Kremlin might have decided that Ushakov is a better person to conduct a dialogue with the Americans. This is that he speaks English and that he is an expert on Western and specifically American affairs. So he is more knowledgeable about American things than Shoigu perhaps is. So anyway, those are the discussions, and Ushakov yesterday, as I said, the point man in some respects in the discussions between the Americans and the Russians up to now. Ushakov came out and said that the ceasefire proposal that had been presented by the Americans was unacceptable. It looked like a temporary ceasefire of a kind that the Ukrainians would be certain to take advantage of. And therefore, and in light of this, the Russians would not be able to accept it in its current form. It would need a lot of adjustment and work, as Ushakov put it. Well, those were Ushakov's words, and that was the state of the information that existed at the time when my program was made. Anyway, shortly after, a much more important Russian official spoke, and that was the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. Now, Lavrov made a very important statement. I'm going to suggest that it is as important as what Putin said about 2 hours after Lavrov spoke. Lavrov's words were obviously coordinated with Putin and clarify a lot about Putin's comments, subsequent comments, and undoubtedly tell us something about what Putin said when he spoke with Donald Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, in the Kremlin later that day. So let me now turn to what Lavrov said. These comments of Lavrov's, to the best of my knowledge, have gone completely unreported in the Western media, and they are little known, even though I consider them to be, as I said, as important in some respects as what Putin himself said. So this was obviously set up in this way. So Lavrov answered a purported question, no idea from whom, but anyway, this is the question. In Saudi Arabia, you in particular discussed with the negotiators the possibility of a temporary ceasefire, and you said that it was not an option. Why do they continue to insist on this? So that was the question. And Lavrov responded as follows. They are not insisting. The Americans announced that they had discussed this with the Ukrainians. They are waiting for our reaction. President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, has repeatedly pointed out that ceasefires have been negotiated on several occasions since 2014, as history shows. The Minsk agreements and previously the agreements that were scrapped in February 2014 and the Istanbul agreements, each of those accords included a ceasefire. However, each time an agreement was reached and a ceasefire announced, it turned out that the Ukrainians had lied to us with the support of their partners who are also from Europe. And then comes the absolutely key paragraph, which to my mind is an extremely interesting paragraph, and it should be seen as a warning to Donald Trump specifically. If the Europeans now want the Ukrainians to outwit the Americans as well, I think that the Trump administration is fully aware of their intentions and will see through them. What we need is a stable and enduring peace based on eliminating the root causes of the current situation in Ukraine. So Lavrov says, again, temporary ceasefires really will not do. What we need is to move forward with a final settlement of the conflict. And we have learnt through bitter experience that when temporary ceasefires are proposed and agreed, the Ukrainians, backed by their European friends, go back on them and violate them. And the Americans must be alert to the possibility that the Ukrainians and the Europeans will do to the Americans exactly the same thing. In other words, the Russians are telling Trump, don't trust what the Ukrainians may be saying to you. They may be telling you, making all sorts of commitments that you think will advance your agenda to achieve a stable and secure peace, but they are almost certainly lying. And the Ukrainians are almost certainly doing that in collusion with the Europeans as well. The Europeans have admitted that when the Minsk agreement was signed in February 2015, they didn't really take it seriously. They used it as a pause in order for Ukraine to re-equip and rearm. They weren't really invested in the peace process that the Minsk agreement outlined, and we're not going to be fooled that way again. And if you really are interested in peace, if peace is really what you are seeking, if you want a stable peace in Europe that will last and which will secure the situation and provide us with the stability that you say you want and which we absolutely want, then don't trust the Europeans and don't trust the Ukrainians, because the Ukrainians will go back on whatever they promise and the Europeans will back them when they do it. So that is the message that Lavrov conveyed, and it is clearly couched as a warning to the Americans. If the Europeans now want to make the Ukrainians outwit the Americans as well, I think that the Trump administration is fully aware of their intentions and will see through them. It's telling the Americans, don't be fooled. Now, actually, there is good reason for Lavrov's warning, and I'm not talking about the past. I'm not talking about what was agreed in February 2014 and in September 2014 and what was agreed again in February 2015 at Minsk and in Istanbul. I'm talking about what has been agreed over the course of this week. The Americans met with the Ukrainians in Jeddah on Tuesday. The Ukrainians came to Jeddah with a whole set of proposals that they had worked out with the Europeans. They were seeking a no-fly zone. They were seeking security guarantees from the Americans. Zelensky told the Americans over the course of the Oval Office meeting that he would not agree to a ceasefire, any kind of ceasefire, without security guarantees, specifically from the United States. He had previously said that he would not sign the mineral rights extraction agreement without security guarantees from the United States. There was talk about a no-fly zone. Macron's proposal, eventually taken up by Zelensky and backed by Starmer, for a cessation of hostilities in the air and on the sea, is clearly an attempt to set up some kind of no-fly zone, Western no-fly zone, over Western Ukraine, at least Western or Central Ukraine. The Ukrainians were also demanding a host of other things as well, European peacekeepers and all of those things. And the joint statement that came out of Jeddah made no reference to any of that. Instead, it talked about a ceasefire, a clean ceasefire, no fly zones. It made no reference to European peacekeepers. It made no references to security guarantees. It didn't refer to Russian aggression, Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty and all of that language that we've seen so often. It simply talked about a ceasefire and the setting up of negotiating teams, the American and the Ukrainian and looked for reciprocal measures from the Russians. That's what it said. All of the Ukrainian demands, in effect, were stripped out. And the Americans also refused to confirm that they agreed to the provision which the Ukrainians insisted on inserting into the joint statement, that the Europeans should participate in the discussions. The joint statement makes it absolutely clear that this was only the Ukrainians who were seeking that. The Americans were not in agreement with it. So that was the Jeddah statement. But what has happened since the Jeddah statement is exactly what you would expect. When the Americans met with the Ukrainians in Jeddah, as I've gone to great lengths to point out, the Americans put the Ukrainians through the third degree. They switched off intelligence assistance, they stopped weapons deliveries, they isolated the Ukrainians from their European friends, they kept Zelensky himself away from the meeting. The meeting went on for 8.5 hours. All of the indicators point to a tough meeting in which the Americans laid out the conditions and set out the line. And that was why we got the joint statement which we saw. But as soon as the Jeddah meeting was out of the way, as soon as the Ukrainians returned to Kiev, as soon as they got back in touch with their European friends, as soon as Zelensky was briefed about what happened, they started to walk everything back, exactly as the Russians here are warning. So Yermak, who was the chief of staff, who's Zelensky's chief of staff, and who led the delegation to Jeddah, is again talking about how the Ukrainian red lines mean that Ukraine has right to enter NATO and right to enter the European Union, that Ukraine should be able to retain its armed forces to whatever size and scale that it wishes. Zelensky has been making statements that Ukraine will never cede legally any of its territory, that it still expects it back. In other words, the Ukrainians have reverted to all the language and rhetoric that they were using before the Jeddah meeting. Language and rhetoric, by the way, which Yermak himself used in an article that he published in The Guardian in Britain, which I mentioned in a previous video. So the Americans may have squeezed the Ukrainians, got them under immense pressure to make those concessions. But just as the Russians, just as Lavrov is warning in that statement, the Ukrainians immediately walked it back. Well, we then, 2 hours after Lavrov's statement, which must be borne in mind when looking at what Putin said, we had the press conference. The press conference which I said yesterday would provide us with clarity, at least some sense of Putin's position, and indeed of the definitive Russian position. And the press conference has duly come, and it was very interesting. And obviously it's been much talked about, but it's not been talked about, as I said, in quite the context that it should be. There's been almost nothing said, as I said, about Lavrov's statement that preceded it. Now, this is a joint press conference. Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, Russia's key ally, was also there. And Lukashenko and Putin had a meeting and a discussion before the press conference started. And it was mainly, from what we can know, a discussion about economic issues, further integration issues between Belarus and Russia, military alliance and all of that. But undoubtedly, they did discuss Ukraine. And Lukashenko was clearly there in the meeting, and he played the role during the press conference, the subsequent press conference, of setting out the tougher position that the Russians feel, and which Putin himself, who chose to use, as I predicted, more diplomatic language, he avoided using. So we had this comment from Lukashenko. The president of Russia once said, I seek to transition his words to a peaceful civilian footing. He once said that we are ready to negotiate with Ukraine, but I want everyone, including Ukrainians, to recognize that we are returning to negotiations 3 years after we initiated them. That is referring to Istanbul, and taking into account the situation on the ground. That is reasonable and prudent. I believe we can apply this military thesis to our civilian domain. Should they return, certain new conditions will apply. These are Lukashenko's words, but Putin was standing right next to him. And as I said, it's after Putin and Lukashenko spoke with each other. Much time has elapsed, and both the conditions and the situation on the ground have evolved. You are welcome to return. You are, of course, the Ukrainians. However, as the president of Russia stated, we have acquired significant insights during this period and will draw the necessary conclusions. In other words, that you cannot be trusted. And then, of course, directly after that statement of Lukashenko's, which, again, I noticed that the media in the West has ignored, we had Putin's words. Now, these have been published and republished and commented upon extensively, but I will go through them in this program and I will pass them. So he was asked a question about the ceasefire. It was obviously a planted question. I think we can take that as read. And Putin's response was obviously very carefully drafted and prepared in advance. This would not have been something that Putin said off the top of his head. His team, his officials, his secretariat would have been working on it. Ushakov undoubtedly would have played a role in drafting it, probably Lavrov as well, in fact definitely Lavrov. So we can be confident that this was an agreed position that the Russians are taking. And I will say first of all that it was couched in extremely diplomatic language, exactly with the intention of keeping the door ajar. It is clearly, again, a rejection of the ceasefire proposal made in Jeddah, the ceasefire proposal that the Americans came up with in Jeddah. But it is, as well as being a rejection of that proposal, it is couched as what the lawyers call an invitation to treat. It's a rejection because it attaches numerous conditions to a ceasefire. And as lawyers would say, and it's important always to remember again that Putin himself is a lawyer by training, a fact he has recently reminded everybody of. If a party adds new conditions to an offer, the party is rejecting the original offer. So it is a rejection, but it is not an outright rejection. It is an invitation to treat. So let's go through this statement and let's go through it carefully. As for Ukraine's readiness, this is Putin speaking, as for Ukraine's readiness for a ceasefire, I will tell you how I view it, of course. And then he begins in this way. I would like to start by thanking the President of the United States, Mr. Trump, for paying so much attention to the Ukraine settlement. We all have enough of our own domestic affairs to attend to. Now, I have to say, this is, in some respects, a compliment and a word of thanks. But I think it is a reminder to Trump of a point that Alex Christoforou and I made in many programs. I took the view, I still take the view, that rather than getting bogged down or drawn into protracted discussion of how to settle the conflict in Ukraine, the best thing for Donald Trump and his team to have done after Trump's inauguration was to tell the Europeans and the Ukrainians that the United States had done all it could, that it really couldn't find the time or the resources to be further involved. Since they were so committed to the conflict, as they always said, it was up to them from that point onward, that the United States had other more important things to do. And I said that, and we said on the Duran, that if Trump tried instead to negotiate a resolution to the conflict, he would find himself sucked into the discussions. It would take up a vast amount of his time, and he would come up against the problem that the Europeans in particular, but the Ukrainians also, would constantly try to pull him back towards a recommitment to the war or to Ukraine's maximalist priorities in a way that the Russians would reject, and that ultimately that would get him nowhere. Well, you see that in a subtle way, the Russians are making the same points. Here we see Putin telling Trump, you are overcommitting yourself to this. You're investing too much in this. You're giving this thing too much time. You have an enormously complex and challenging domestic agenda, and you're spending all your time instead worrying and talking about Ukraine. And we've just had Lavrov warn Trump and his people, don't trust the Europeans over the course of negotiations. They will simply come back and try to bend you and to pull you back to their positions. Well, Trump, for better or for worse, took the decision that he was going to commit to negotiations. In fact, he's in the process of setting up a negotiating team, which was one of the things that came out of the Jeddah talks. I'm not sure that was a good idea myself, but there it is. That's where we are. The Russians are giving their warnings. I hope that from now on, Trump heeds them. Anyway, Putin then goes on to say this. Many leaders of states, among them the president of China, the prime minister of India, the presidents of Brazil and of South Africa, are addressing this issue and give it a lot of their time. We are grateful to all of them for that, because this activity is aimed at achieving a noble mission, the mission of ending hostilities and loss of life. This is my first point. Now, notice what Putin is doing here. On the one hand, he's telling his allies, the BRIC states, China, India, Brazil, and South Africa, well, we know that you've done an awful lot of hard work. Don't think that that's not appreciated. It may be that Trump is now talking to us, but you've played a role and we note it. But what Putin is also doing is he's reminding Trump that Russia is not alone, that it has friends, in China, India, Brazil, South Africa, the BRICS, the global south, that threats of all-out economic war against Russia are not going to succeed, and all they will do is consolidate and entrench further the BRICS process, about which the Americans are so worried about because of its long-term effect on the dollar, And of course, ultimately, it will mean that the sanctions themselves, whatever sanctions the Americans try to impose, that those sanctions are going to be undermined. And incidentally, and for the record, I'm hearing reports that there's been a jump in purchases of Russian oil, and the Indians are apparently buying Russian oil again. But more importantly, the Chinese are stepping up their purchases of Russian oil and are using sanctioned oil tankers to ship that oil to their ports. Just saying. Anyway, so then Putin then made his second point, and it's a very important point. Second, we agree with the proposals to cease hostilities, but proceed from the assumption that this cessation should lead to long-term peace and eliminate the root causes of this crisis. So what Putin is saying is, yes, absolutely, we want to. We're not here to fight. We're here to achieve a negotiated solution. But of course, given all the backstory, that has to be what the purpose of any cessation of hostilities, any ceasefire is all about. It can't be a temporary stop to the fighting. It must be part of an agreement which will, as he says, eliminate the root causes of this crisis. Now here I should explain something, which is that I've often spoken in many programs about Istanbul Plus. I rolled up the various things that Putin said in his speech to the Russian Foreign Ministry in June last year, and I put all that together, and I have called it Istanbul Plus. And, well, that expression has actually been picked up by some people in independent media, and we use it regularly on the Duran, but it is not a Russian term. The Russians have never used it. I've never seen a single Russian commentator or official speak about Istanbul Plus. What they talk about is the root causes of this crisis. But the point is that Istanbul Plus, what I call Istanbul Plus, Putin's proposals made in June last year, are the way through to resolving the root causes of this conflict. It's what the Russians say needs to be done as part of any peace settlement, because if it is not done, then the root causes of the conflict will fester. And that is that the four regions must be transferred to Russia, together with Crimea, that Ukraine must demilitarize, must denuclearize, that there must be fundamental changes to the Ukrainian political system, that all of the various provisions of the original Istanbul Agreement must be carried forward, but there must be the additions to it of the expansion of the territory that Russia controls, plus also there must be agreements about things like NATO membership. That is obviously non-negotiable. The Russians will insist on Ukraine's neutrality, but also there must be agreements about the significant reduction in the size of the Ukrainian armed forces. So that is what Putin is talking about. So he's saying, look, we're prepared to consider a ceasefire, but it must be a ceasefire that leads back to the outcome that we want, which is in effect Istanbul Plus. And then Putin says this: now, on Ukraine's readiness to cease the hostilities, on the face of it, the US-Ukraine meeting in Saudi Arabia may look like the Ukrainian side made this decision under pressure from the United States. It did, in fact. As I said previously, what the Ukrainians were trying to do was to try to get the Americans to commit to establishment of a no-fly zone, not a ceasefire at all, because, as I've said in many programs, the Ukrainian objective is to draw the Americans into the war in order to get the Americans to defeat the Russians for them. Anyway, Putin says it may have been the Americans who told the Ukrainians, your hopes of no-fly zones and all of that won't be acceptable, aren't unacceptable. We want a ceasefire, and the Ukrainians reluctantly agreed. But Putin says this, in fact, I'm absolutely convinced that the Ukrainian side should have asked the Americans for this decision most emphatically in view of the situation evolving on the ground, as has just been mentioned here. Mentioned, by the way, by Lukashenko. But what Putin is talking about is the military situation. And Putin then goes into a long discussion about the military situation. He talks about how he has just visited Kursk region, that he's discussed the situation there with the military, the Russian military. He says that the situation in Kursk there is completely under our control, and the grouping that invaded our territory has been isolated, in other words, surrounded. It is completely isolated and under complete fire control. The control of Ukrainian troops inside this incursion zone has been lost. And then he discusses how previously some dribbles of Ukrainian troops were able to escape. They're trying to get out in very small groups of 2 or 3 men because everything is under our complete fire control. Now it is impossible for the Ukrainians to retreat. And he says that the military equipment has been completely abandoned. And he says that no one will be able to leave. There will only be 2 options, surrender or die. And he says, I think in these conditions, it would be good for the Ukrainians to achieve a ceasefire for at least 30 days. So the situation is really bad for the Ukrainians in Kursk region. And then he made the comment, which has attracted so much attention. We also are in favor of it, but there are nuances. What are they? Now, here, I would say that I am absolutely not an expert in the Russian language. I do not have that understanding of idiomatic Russian that some people, well, that Russians obviously have. And I suspect that it would be very difficult even for most people who speak Russian fluently, Westerners who speak Russian fluently, to get a sense of this. But Larry Johnson, he who does that superb blog, Sonar 21, has spoken to Andrei Martyanov, who obviously is Russian. And I've heard this from others as well, that this expression, we are also in favor of it, but there are nuances, is deeply ironical. It says, well, we may be in favor of it, but really, are you serious? Is this really something that you really expect us to do, given where we've put the Ukrainians? Apparently there are even, shall I say, coarser takes on these words. Well, there are many Russians who watch these videos, maybe on the threads. They can set out what they think about this. But anyway, that's what I've heard. Anyway, we are also in favor of it, but there are nuances. What are they? And then Putin goes through them one by one. He ticks them off. And this is clearly a prepared list. Again, to repeat, he's not talking off the top of his head, Obviously, there's been a discussion. He's not reading from a prepared text. This is one of the extraordinary things about Putin. He has the ability to retain all these thoughts in his head. This is, by the way, in part, a product of his legal training, I am sure. But he has that ability to remember these points and to set them out in the way that an advocate does when they appear before a court. And he says, first, what will we do about the incursion in Kursk? What would that mean if we cease fire for 30 days? Does that mean that everyone who is there, he means the Ukrainians, just walk out without a fight? Do we have to let them go after they committed numerous heinous crimes against civilians? Or will the Ukrainian leadership issue a command for them to lay down their arms and just surrender? How will this happen? It is not clear. And then he goes on to say, how will other issues along the entire contact line be solved? It is almost 2,000 kilometers long. As you know, Russian troops are advancing in almost all areas of combat contact. Conditions are also very favorable there for us to block rather large units there. Now, again, there's a narrative that has been spread in some places that the main contact line in Donbass has somehow stabilized over the last few weeks. This is emphatically not the case. There have been slower advances because of the effect of the Rasputitsa, but the Russians have continued to advance in many positions. They've expanded their bridgehead across the Oskol River. They've established a second bridgehead in Kharkiv region, which people have not spoken about very much. They're very close to surrounding Siversk. They've been extending their advance along the Zherebets River. They are very close. They've taken further steps towards encircling the Ukrainian troops in Chasiv Yar. And by the way, in that salient between Toretsk and Chasiv Yar, where the Ukrainians have significant forces. Recently, they crossed the Seversky Donets aqueduct in another place, captured further positions. Gradually, you can see that a new, well, maybe not a cauldron, but a new area of, shall we say, potential encirclement is being created there. And the same ultimately is true in Pokrovsk, as I've discussed in many places. And the Russians also have been advancing steadily west of Velikaya Novosilka and have been encircling the various Ukrainian villages west of the Andreevka fortified area, which has passed completely under Russian control. So he says conditions are also very favorable there for us to block rather large units there. So how would these 30 days be used? For forced mobilization to continue in Ukraine, for more weapons to be supplied there, for retraining the mobilized units, or would none of this be done? Well, bear in mind what the Russians have been saying for weeks and months, that the problem with temporary ceasefires is that Ukraine simply uses those ceasefires to redeploy and retrain and regroup and rearm, and the Europeans especially have been helping the Ukrainians do all of those things. So Putin says, look, if we agree a 30-day ceasefire, what guarantee do we have that none of these things will happen? And then he goes on to say, if so, how will issues related to control and verification be addressed? How can we guarantee and receive guarantees that nothing like this would happen? How will control procedures be organized? I hope everyone understands the complexity of all this at the level of common sense. These are all serious issues. And then he goes on to say, who will order to cease fire? What is the price of these orders? Just imagine, almost 2,000 kilometers. Who will be able to determine who violated the potential ceasefire agreement over a distance of 2,000 kilometers and where exactly? Who will be held responsible for violating the ceasefire? All these issues must be meticulously worked upon by both sides. The idea itself is right, and of course we support it. However, there are issues that must be discussed. I think we must talk them over with our American colleagues and partners. And he's now suddenly started calling the Americans partners again. Perhaps have a telephone conversation with President Trump and discuss them with him. However, the idea to put an end to this conflict by peaceful means gets our full support. Now, he's not talking about the ceasefire here. He's not saying that the ceasefire gets full support. He's talking about a negotiated solution, which will lead us ultimately to the point where the root causes of the conflict are addressed, settling it once and for all, which means Istanbul Plus. Now, the fact that Putin was in effect rejecting the ceasefire was well understood across the Western media yesterday. There was extraordinary expressions of outrage that he should attach conditions like this to any ceasefire. But why would he not? And I have to make the absolutely obvious point that all of the concerns that he's expressing about monitoring the ceasefire, about Ukraine misusing the ceasefire to rearm and redeploy and retrain, about the behavior of the Europeans, about all of those things. These are perfectly valid concerns from a Russian point of view. In fact, it would be astonishing, it would be negligent of Putin at this point in the conflict, after all that's happened in the past, if he did not address these concerns. And he's saying to Trump, look, we've said what we think. This must lead to a proper settlement. That settlement must address the root causes of the conflict, as we have said. That does mean Istanbul Plus, but he won't have said that to Trump because, as I said, Istanbul Plus is what I call it, but effectively that is what it means. But, you know, we are not here to fight wars. We've never really wanted to fight wars. That's never been what we did. We were pushed into this because the Ukrainians and the Europeans didn't keep their promises. And, well, maybe not you personally, but Biden and Obama and his people and their people, I mean, they were accessories to it all as well. So that's what Putin said. And then Putin had a meeting with Witkoff late at night, very late at night, and he will undoubtedly have told Witkoff many of the same things, but he will undoubtedly also have reassured Witkoff that the Russians are, as I said, willing to treat, but they do want all of these issues to be addressed, and that will require substantive talks. Now, I'm going to make a guess that Putin has already developed some ideas about how to deal with some of these problems with the ceasefire that he outlined, and for all I know, he's passed some of those ideas on to Witkoff. He talks a lot about monitoring and supervision of ceasefires. Obviously, the Europeans are not trusted by the Russians anymore. Notice that Putin never mentions them in any part of these comments. The only comment about the Europeans has come from Lavrov, and Lavrov has warned Trump, have nothing to do with those people, or if you must, keep them at arm's length. They are not to be trusted here. They are going to try to drag you and the United States both into this conflict. Anyway, back into this conflict. So I wonder whether a possible proposal that Putin might have made to Witkoff, and which he might be passing on to Trump, is that implementation of the ceasefire, if there is one, would be undertaken by the Americans and the Russians jointly. Just saying. Now, I don't know that that is the case, but Russian and American teams operating together on the conflict lines, on the battle lines, the Russians and the Americans exchanging information. I've seen it done before. I remember that in the Middle East, in one of the conflicts in the Middle East, in Sinai to be precise, at a time when there was a ceasefire between the Egyptians and the Israelis, I remember seeing Russian, well, they were Soviet in those days, Soviet and American ceasefire monitors driving around in jeeps and doing the work together. The Ukrainians would be furious if this proposal were ever made, and the Europeans would be horrified. But we come back to that warning that Lavrov has given about being very careful about what the Ukrainians and the Europeans are up to. Anyway, I don't want to insist on this. I don't know that this is part of the Russian proposal. I don't know even that Putin has actually worked out any of these things. But anyway, that's what Putin said. That was what he said yesterday. This has to be a ceasefire that takes us towards Istanbul Plus, including ultimately, of course, withdrawal by the Ukrainians from territories. Maybe that's not been set out in detail, but certainly that's what the Russians will expect. The Russians are not giving any ground on any of that. And in the meantime, all of these concerns have to be addressed. Now, after all that, we have had two posts by Donald Trump, and they strongly suggest that Trump, at least for the moment, is hearing what the Russians are saying and is taking account of this. So the first post says this: crooked Joe Biden got us into a real mess with Russia and everything else, but I'm going to get us out. Millions of people are needlessly dead, never to be seen again, and there will be many more to follow if we don't get the ceasefire and final agreement with Russia completed and signed. So Trump is no longer talking just about a ceasefire. He's talking about a final agreement as well. And the two are joined up and connected to each other. It is indeed Biden's fault. I said that the Russians will have pointed out that in all the previous ceasefires, it wasn't just the Europeans who played a role in undermining them, but previous administrations, Obama's and Biden's, played a key role as well. And perhaps Trump has taken all that on board. But the Russians have said ceasefire, there's going to be one, must be followed, but this time by a final agreement, not Minsk, the Minsk agreement, which was set out a pathway to a final agreement, but an actual final agreement. And notice that Trump says there will be many more to follow, many more deaths to follow, if we don't get the ceasefire and final agreement with Russia completed and signed. We, Russia and the United States. The most fascinating thing about this comment on Truth Social that Trump has published is that it doesn't refer to Ukraine once. It reduces the entire conflict to a conflict between Russia and the United States, one in which crooked Joe Biden got the United States involved, and it is the Russians and the Americans, with Donald Trump obviously playing the key role, who must find a way through and out of it together, and that means ceasefire and final agreement. And by the way, I notice, though perhaps one shouldn't attach too much in it, that ceasefire, Trump actually separates the words. It's ceasefire rather than ceasefire as a noun. Maybe that's just his way of spelling. He does have his own way of spelling things sometimes. But ceasefire is closer to Putin's formula of cessation of hostilities rather than temporary ceasefire of the sort that the Americans and the Ukrainians talked about, and as is outlined in the statement that came out of Jeddah. I want to make it clear that, this may just be Trump's own way of spelling. I'm not attaching very much to that particular point, but I did notice it, and I just mention it in passing. Anyway, that was the first of two posts that Trump published. The next one, which came out a little later, was also interesting, and it said the following: "We had very good and productive discussions with President Vladimir Putin of Russia yesterday, and there is a very good chance that this horrible bloody war can finally come to an end. But at this very moment, thousands of Ukrainian troops are completely surrounded by the Russian military and in a very bad and vulnerable position. I have strongly requested to President Putin that their lives be spared. This would be a horrible massacre and not seen since World War II. God bless them all." Now, this is an interesting post, and the media in Britain, as I'm making this program, takes it to mean that Trump and Putin have spoken to each other and that there's actually been a phone call between them. Now, that may be the case, but that's not actually what this post says. It says, "We had very good and productive discussions with President Vladimir Putin of Russia yesterday." Now, that could refer, and I think it is more likely to refer, to the meeting between Putin and Steve Witkoff in the Kremlin late last night, Moscow time. Trump does sometimes use the expression "we," the word "we," to refer to himself, just saying. But in this case, I don't think he is. I think it's more likely, as I said, the discussion between Witkoff and Putin, that those are the very good and productive discussions that Trump is referring to. Now, note some other things about this post. "We had a very good and productive discussions with President Vladimir Putin of Russia yesterday, and there is a very good chance that this horrible bloody war can finally come to an end." There's no reference here to a ceasefire. This doesn't actually talk about a ceasefire. It talks about an ending of the war. And that is logical if you go back to the previous post, which talked about ceasefire and a final settlement, so that there's going to be a negotiation to try to settle the war. It looks to me that what Trump perhaps was looking for, was worried about, was that the Russians would say, well, we're winning, we've got ourselves in the position where we're in a position to win the war, so why should we negotiate at all? I've discussed in program after program why I don't think that that is what the Russians, for simple calculations of self-interest, want to do. They would rather have a negotiated outcome agreed with the United States than a simple military victory. I'm not going to talk about all of that again. I've already discussed it at the start of this program. And I think I get the sense that Trump was relieved about that. And Putin probably said to Witkoff, as I've already said, look, we're not against the cessation of hostilities, maybe not the ceasefire that you're proposing, but there's an awful lot that needs to be done. Yes, we do have some ideas of our own, which we will probably want to discuss with you. But let's first of all work this through. We can work it through together and we can come to an agreement. And we can also discuss with each other what the ultimate framework of the peace is going to be. So Trump talks about a very good chance that this horrible, bloody war can finally come to an end. Notice, again, that he's not any longer talking about in a few weeks, shortly, tomorrow, next week, today, or anything like that. But he's talking finally about a very good chance that this horrible, bloody war can finally come to an end. And then he's talking about how he's trying to get the Russians to spare the lives of the Ukrainian troops who are surrounded in Kursk region. Now, here we come back to previous history. Back in February 2015, a Ukrainian force found itself surrounded in the small town of Debaltseve in eastern Ukraine, as it then was, in Donbass. There was panic about this. Right across the west, the best part of the Ukrainian army found itself encircled and at risk of destruction. Angela Merkel got particularly alarmed. She took a flight to Moscow. She had a meeting in private with Putin in the Kremlin. Apparently not even interpreters were present and no stenographic record was kept. Though, as I said, I firmly believe that the Russians will have made a recording of the entire conversation. But that meeting between Merkel and Putin was what led to the Minsk agreement, and what drove the Western powers to act in that way was the imperative of rescuing the Ukrainian troops who were trapped in Debaltseve. Now, that ultimately was what happened. The Ukrainians were able to retreat from Debaltseve, though in far from good order, and only after very, very heavy losses. The Russians will have a very vivid memory of all of this, and they will remember that as soon as the Ukrainians got out of Debaltseve, the Western powers, the Germans and the French, Merkel, having extracted those Ukrainian troops from Debaltseve, lost interest in the whole idea of negotiations and settlements of the conflict, and the Minsk agreement that she negotiated effectively with Putin and bullied the Ukrainian president Petro Poroshenko to sign. Well, she then lost interest in it because the immediate crisis of the potential collapse of the Ukrainian army had been averted, and she very quickly drifted back into a position of effectively unconditional support from Ukraine, for Ukraine. So the Russians will remember all of that. Putin, of course, will remember all of that because he was at the center of all the discussions that took place. And if he's now receiving urgent requests from Donald Trump to spare the lives of Ukrainian soldiers, a part of his mind is going to say to him, this is Debaltseve all over again. The Americans are rushing to save the Ukrainians. They've never shown any interest in the welfare of our troops. If we really do let these Ukrainian troops go, well, who knows? The urgency will have gone, and perhaps the Americans will let off on this. For the moment, there's been no response to any of this from the Russians, and my own sense is that the Russians will probably tighten the ring around the Ukrainian troops who are trapped in Kursk region, and will basically tell them to surrender, and we could get a mass surrender or something like that. But I don't think that the Russians this time will be quite as accommodating as Trump wants them to be. Certainly, I don't think that there will be a massacre of the Ukrainian troops in Kursk region. I think that possibly what the Russians will do, following from what Putin said yesterday at the press conference, is they'll say to the Americans, well, look, we're not going to kill anybody. We're not looking to kill anybody. The best way to get out of this crisis is to get Zelensky to order those troops to give up and surrender. I can imagine Zelensky disagreeing, but anyway, I suspect that that is the first thing that the Russians are going to do. We will see how this plays out. But the key point here is that in these two posts on Truce Social, Trump seems to be heeding Putin's points that, yes, the Russians are looking for a negotiated outcome of the war, or at least they would prefer one to outright military victory, though, to be clear, a military victory is absolutely an option and one which they will pursue if they have no alternative, as they have shown. But because the Americans are now a party, a direct party to the negotiations, and because the Americans are now accepting that they are a party to the conflict, Rubio has already described it as a proxy war between Russia and the United States, and Trump, in these two posts, especially the first one, is also couching it as basically a conflict between the United States and Russia, which is why it's those two countries that need to settle this conflict with each other. Anyway, because of all of that, maybe, possibly, we will see this process move forward. Interestingly enough, both Mike Waltz, Trump's national security advisor, and Peskov are talking about the situation, how they both feel. Peskov's spokesman, right? Peskov, Putin's spokesman, are both saying that they are cautiously optimistic. This is how TASS reports Peskov's words. Undoubtedly, there are reasons for cautious optimism. Peskov noted, this is from TASS, commenting on remarks by US Presidential National Security Advisor Mike Waltz. You must have heard the important statement that President Putin made yesterday. He said in response to questions from reporters that he backed Trump's position on the settlement. Not the ceasefire again, notice the settlement. This is why, even though there is still a lot to be done, the president, that's to say Putin, sided with Mr. Trump's stance. So, we are perhaps edging towards some kind of negotiation. A negotiation between the Americans and the Russians. I suspect that Putin will have told Witkoff that the Russians will now also form their own negotiating team. And I suspect also that there will be a telephone call between Putin and Trump over the next couple of days, assuming that one hasn't already happened. And there will be agreements on the location of the meeting. And, well, for all we know, that could be in Saudi Arabia. I say Saudi Arabia because, along with meeting Lukashenko, holding a massive press conference and meeting with Witkoff, Putin also managed to speak to MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. It's an interesting call, and I will just outline it. The Russian readout doesn't tell us who initiated the call, but it looks to me from the Russian readout that it was the Russians. And the Russian readout says this: the Russian president congratulated the leadership and people of Saudi Arabia on the holy month of Ramadan for Muslims and conveyed his best wishes to King Salman bin Abdulaziz Al Saud. Now that actually is very courteous, and it is actually more courteous than the joint statement the Ukrainians and the Americans published after the meeting in Jeddah. I mentioned in my discussion of that meeting in my program on Wednesday that I found it striking that in the joint statement the Americans and the Ukrainians thanked MBS, but they didn't mention the King of Saudi Arabia. Given how protocol conscious the Saudis are, I think that might have been a mistake, and one which could have caused some offence. Putin is absolutely not making that mistake. He speaks warmly to MBS himself, but he doesn't forget to also convey his best wishes to the king. The Russians are much more careful of this kind of thing than I think the Americans are. And then the readout goes on to say, current issues of Russian-Saudi cooperation within the framework of OPEC Plus were discussed. The importance of this unique format for ensuring stability of the global oil market, maintaining a balance between supply and demand in the interests of both producers and consumers of raw materials was emphasized. The commitment of Russia and Saudi Arabia to comply with the obligations assumed in OPEC Plus was emphasized. Now this is interesting because over the last few hours, the United States has tried to put some pressure on the Russians. Licenses granted to Russian banks to process payment transactions for Russian oil by European customers were withdrawn. So those Russian banks are no longer able to use SWIFT, for example. So there's been some attempt to try to interfere with Russian oil exports to Europe. However, that really isn't going to have much effect because, as we know, most Russian oil that gets exported to Europe is now laundered through third countries, mostly India, just saying. But there's also been some talk, again, of imposing further oil price caps on Russian oil. The United States cooled on that idea after Trump was inaugurated, but there's been some suggestions that the G7 are looking at it again. Probably that was more intended, as I said, to unnerve the Russians than anything else. The Saudis hate the idea of oil price caps. They see that as the consumers trying to dictate the price of oil, which is something that the Saudis strongly object to. As far as they're concerned, it is they, via the mechanism of OPEC Plus, who dictate the price of oil. So here we are. Here we have Putin and the Saudis, Putin and the Russians and the Saudis, Putin and MBS coming together and basically saying as much. If the Americans and the Europeans try to crank up the pressure on the Russians by imposing further price caps on Russian oil, OPEC Plus will oppose that, and the oil alliance between Russia and Saudi Arabia will continue. It's important to say that for MBS, for the Saudis, who don't have the dominant position as a single producer in the oil market that they had in, say, the 1970s, the oil alliance with Russia is vital because it means that through agreements with the Russians, they are able to set the price for the vast bulk of oil that is internationally traded. If Russia is taken out of the picture, then the Saudis find themselves up against the United States, which produces as much oil as they do now. Just saying. So that explains why for the Saudis, OPEC Plus matters. And then, anyway, we come to the most important part of the readout, taking into account the international contacts held in the kingdom. Mohammed bin Salman noted the importance of resolving the Ukrainian crisis and expressed his readiness to continue to contribute in every way to the normalization of Russian-American relations. I have to say that that paragraph looks to me as saying, in effect, that Putin asked MBS, is Saudi Arabia willing to host a US-Russia presidential summit meeting, a meeting between Putin and Trump, and MBS saying, absolutely, of course we will. We will take every step we can to facilitate the normalization of Russian-American relations. And then we see that Putin, presumably after getting that assurance, was very pleased and thanked MBS for it. The readout says, in turn, the Russian president highly praised the mediation efforts of Saudi Arabia and thanked it in particular for creating favorable conditions for holding negotiations between representatives of Russia and the United States in Riyadh on February 18th. And then the readout ends, both sides noted with satisfaction the high level of Russian-Saudi cooperation and confirmed their commitment to its further development in a friendly and constructive manner. So I take this to mean that a Putin-Trump summit is coming. It may happen probably fairly soon. There will no doubt be a telephone conversation to arrange it. No doubt Putin and Trump will meet. The whole question of ceasefires or cessations of hostilities and moves to a final agreement will be discussed. We could very well have a framework agreement come out of this summit meeting. Just saying. Again, the Europeans won't like that at all, and nor will the Ukrainians. And, well, then we'll see. There's an awful lot going on. I think if we look at all of the various statements that have been made over the course of the last couple of days, Ushakov's, Lavrov's, Putin's, Lukashenko's, Trump's, those made by Mike Waltz as well, well, we can see how the two sides, and I mean the Americans and the Russians, are gradually working towards each other. Now, I want to say none of this in any way means that we are actually going to get an agreement. There will be many problems along the way. The Europeans are not going to be happy with any of this. They're going to do everything they possibly can to sabotage it. We've already seen how the Ukrainians are trying to go back on everything that they committed themselves to in Jeddah when they met the Americans on Tuesday. And Zelensky himself remains a massive problem. I have heard it said that one of the reasons why the Americans are so keen to arrange a ceasefire is because they want elections to happen in Ukraine without any further delay. And basically, they want those elections to replace Zelensky with a new leader in Ukraine. Probably the Russians agree with that too, though I ought to say that if the American expectation is that Tymoshenko will be more accommodating than Zelensky is, well, that is possible. But Tymoshenko also has had her role in the Maidan movement, and she might not prove quite as accommodating as the Americans imagine. And besides, she has many, many opponents in Ukraine itself. Incidentally, the Russians have been speaking about other leaders, other potential leaders, including other leaders closer to home. And I can't help but think that they may still mean Viktor Medvedchuk, and they might want to discuss that with the Americans also. But anyway, the Ukrainians remain an intractable problem. The Europeans remain a huge problem as well going forward. You can see that in the very hostile language with which the European media responded to Putin's comments of yesterday. As I said, there's no guarantee that any of this is going to work, and the Russians themselves remain deeply suspicious and very, very careful. And I'm going to also say it, I think that we've probably now already gone past Istanbul Plus. As I said in my previous program, in his meeting with Larry Johnson and the other American bloggers, Lavrov veered off into a long discussion about proposals that were being floated in 2014 for Ukraine's federalization. I would not be surprised if we saw that coming as well. And again, I wonder why the Americans would object. Though again, getting the Ukrainians on side is going to be a major problem. But anyway, my feeling is that we have got closer to a negotiation. But as I said, don't assume that the outcome of that negotiation is going to be positive. And in fact, it's almost certain that there will be many bumps along the road. But Trump wants a deal. That is absolutely clear. We go back to what he said, to his first post. He said that crooked Joe Biden got us into a real mess with Russia. but I am going to get us out. Notice he talks about us. He means the United States into a real mess with Russia. So he doesn't think that this conflict with Russia has done the United States any good at all. And about that, by the way, I agree with him. But he has staked his prestige now on a peaceful settlement. I don't see how he can go back on that. I think that inevitably is going to draw him into an agreement, which inevitably is going to be basically on Russian terms, which, however, are pitched at a level that they don't in any way cause injury to the core interests of the United States. Now, I ought to say that there's a number of commentaries that have been appearing about the leverage or lack of leverage that the United States has over the Russians. And interestingly enough, and for the first time, I've seen comments in the British media, in The Guardian and the Financial Times, for example, acknowledging that in practice the United States has very little leverage over the Russians at all, that escalating the economic war is not going to be successful against the Russians, that stepping up arms supplies to Ukraine would completely contradict what Donald Trump has been talking and saying he would do, and that isn't going to succeed either. After all, there have already been so many American arms supplies, and what have they achieved? There are, however, still holdouts. You still find occasional articles that acknowledge that that still repeat the myth that the United States, by imposing sanctions, could devastate the Russian economy, that Russia's economy is under excessive stress, that the Russian military is under excessive stress. It astonishes me that 3 years after the economic war was launched, those fantasies continue to circulate. And to say it simply, they are untrue. On economic matters, we see growing evidence of recession in the West. The British economy, by the way, it's now confirmed, contracted in January. The Russian economy is still expanding, and there's reasons to think that before long, inflation and interest rates will start to come down. On the military front, well, we've just seen the disaster the Ukrainians have suffered in Kursk region, and it looks as if a large number of their troops, several thousand probably, are encircled. I wish people would stop this constant rhetoric about the leverage the West has over the Russians and about how the Russians are becoming exhausted in this war, when all of the evidence points to the contrary conclusion. Well, this is where I finish my program today. We will see what happens over the next couple of days. I expect that before long there will be a Putin-Trump call. It may happen as soon as tomorrow. If it hasn't, of course, already happened. If it has happened, then tomorrow I will discuss it in my program. But this is where I finish my program today. So that's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.